Welcome back, metalheads. Today I'm spinning the wax with Andrea Morgan of Exulansis and the Keening, and we're listening to Buried Inside's 2005 work of art, Chronoclast, selected essays on time-reckoning and auto-cannibalism. Don't go anywhere, it all starts right now.
But it gazed down the bars of its cage and slowly stopped.
Hello again, my friends, and welcome back to Spinning the Wax, where we listen to your favorite artists' favorite records. My name is John Garcia, aka Stay Puffed, the metal marshmallow, the heaviest mallow in the universe, and your friendly neighborhood headbanger. On this episode, violinist and singer Andrea Morgan stops by to introduce me to the now defunct Canadian band Buried Inside. Andrea is an absolutely wonderful human being and captivating performer who plays in Rebecca Vernon's new project, The Keening, as well as atmospheric blackened doom metal band Exulansis, where she plays with her brother. Andrea has also performed with bands such as Panopticon, Megaton Leviathan, Aerial Ruin, Mortuous, and many, many more. For our album listen today, she brings on Buried Inside's Chronoclast, selected essays on time-reckoning and auto-cannibalism. As the wordy title would suggest, this is a concept album where each song is a sort of essay about how time rules our lives and everything like that. It's very heady, it's very big brain shit. I'll let Andrea explain it more in the episode, as well as talk about the intricacies and stuff like that in the music, but needless to say, I had never heard of this band before she had presented this to me. And having a musician's musician along for the ride made this excellent album even better. There are so many moving parts, Easter eggs, like I said, musical intricacies, and combined with their sludge meets post-metal sound, this record sounds as fresh today as it did 20 years ago in 2005. During our chat, Andrea opens up about what it's like to live as a full-time musician, as well as the sacrifices that she has to choose to make in order to live out her dream. She also talks about being one of the few full-time violinists in metal, as well as being immensely influenced by the band SubRosa when she was a budding musician, and what it's like now getting to perform, create, and tour with Rebecca Vernon, including their most recent tour of Europe and the United States earlier this year. One of those performances was on the main stage of Roadburn 2024, where I was enthralled with everything that I was seeing and hearing. You'll hear a little bit more about that in a bit. Of course, she also waxes poetic about this album and how it's inspired her more than she'll ever know, and how all of the musical bits combine to make Chronoclast a timeless record. See what I did there? And finally, she shares a story about reaching out to the string player that played on this record and the response that he gave her in return. I don't want to spoil it because it is so fucking good and it is so wholesome and you need to hear it. Bottom line, follow your heart, everyone. That's the big takeaway from this episode. Just follow your heart. So it's time, my friends. Let's dig into this episode. From the Keening, from Exulansis, please welcome Andrea Morgan to the program. Andrea, welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Thanks, John. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Did I get all the bands correct, or did I miss about 20 of them that we don't know about?
There's those are definitely the ones I've recorded with in recent history. Been doing some live stints with people. Been out on tour and stuff. We just got done with the Paul Bearer tour, and I had the pleasure of playing endless places with them, and then at the end of the tour, I got to play a song with Rwake, which was awesome. They're one of my favorite bands. They played, I think, 5 dates with us on the tour. And then after the tour ended, they were doing their own gig in Little Rock. And I was already going to be in town. And so they asked me to play the song Leviticus with them, which is on their album Voices of Omens. Which is one of my favorite albums of all time. So it was such a huge honor to get asked to do that with them. And they're all just like the sweetest people on earth. They're just like so hospitable and kind. And it was just and I've been really influenced by their music over time too, and really getting to like sit there and delve into it's one thing to like listen to music, but it's
Hmm.
another thing like delving into it as a performer and kind of listening to it in that way and getting to do that and sort of realizing like, oh wow, like I was more influenced by this than I even thought I was, so
I love
it
that.
was
Did
really
you
fun.
so how much heads up did you have to before performing Leviathan with them?
Not a lot. I
Did
was
did you
like,
know it from like memory or so? That's where I was going to be going next. So just like were you just like chugging it in your ears before going on stage or something like that?
kind of, yeah. I mean, I think I really only had like a couple of moments beforehand to kind of like play along with it, and they were kind of just like, yeah, just like do your thing, like go crazy, like do whatever you want. And I in hindsight, I wish I would have had a little bit more time with it,
Of
I
course,
probably would have
yeah.
done a little bit more, but we played to a a crowd, a really, really excited crowd at Whitewater Tavern, which is just an amazing place in Little Rock. It's just they have an amazing community, amazing music scene there. And we had a really good time. It was awesome.
That's amazing. Did you I guess since you're classically trained and have been playing since about 11, I think, and have, went to music school and all this stuff. Do you see like the bars and the notes in your brain, or are you just like can you just like feel the music now in like in a performance like that where you like mostly know the music but you don't really know the music, so you're just going to have to put in your own touches and stuff like that? Like what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, especially when it comes to just playing, more creatively as opposed to like, for me, it's a completely different mindset to play classical music, just because it's so much more specific as far as, what is to be played and how it's to be played.
Hmm.
And so I do have to think about, key signatures and articulation and dynamics in a totally different way. And so playing music in bands kind of allows me to kind of break away from that mindset a little bit and just and feel out the music. I've got a little bit of the synesthesia thing
Oh,
that people
interesting.
talk
Okay.
about
Yeah.
where, like people see like certain colors and shapes associated with, different notes and different chord progressions and stuff like that. And Wake is such a colorful band in that way,
Interesting.
when I
What do
listen
you
to their music,
what do you see?
it's just kind of like, like how you might imagine, like, when you see a band on stage and maybe there's like, I don't know, fog or haze on stage and it kind of hits the lights in a certain way,
Hmm.
I definitely see like a kind of a foggy mist of color depending on, like I'm talking about Wake specifically at
Sure,
this
sure.
moment, but yeah, a lot of like greens and purples and blues and orange and like sometimes like brownish, reddish green, like kind of like what you might imagine as sludge,
Yeah.
like I don't know how to really explain that, but yeah, like and sometimes I do like, if I don't know a song as well or I haven't prepared for it as much, I guess I am kind of like, fishing a little bit for like I can hear certain notes and be like, okay, they're kind of like cruising in this key for a little bit, but maybe I don't want to play the exact same thing that the guitar player is playing or whatever. So then I have to start thinking about like how can I stack this with like thirds or fifths or fourths or kind of complement and accentuate whatever they're playing. And that's often these days especially is kind of what I'm sort of brought in to do is
Yeah.
sort of kind of just accentuate what's already present in the music.
Yeah, I love that. I'll probably be picking and like asking questions about like your synesthesia as we're listening to the album that we're about to listen to. But before we get into that, I guess I should say, for listeners getting caught up, one of the reasons why I wanted to have Andrea on was because I caught the keening at Roadburn, who the keening is the solo project of Rebecca Vernon, formerly of SubRosa, and she put out this amazing just immersive album that's not quite doom metal, it's not quite folk metal, it's like this one thing, all of its own. And you were played on that album and put in some some musical creative parts on it as well. And the Keening was playing Little Bird, the album that she released, in full in Roadburn, and I had just such a experience watching y'all play at that. And it was everything, because it was like how captivating you are as a violinist and a singer on stage, and just the music that Rebecca plays. I had heard the album before and had liked it, but it didn't click with me because of like how kind of dense it is and how much it takes so much repeated listens to get in. But it clicked for me at that moment when I was watching it. I was on mushrooms, so that probably had a little bit to do with it. It is, the Netherlands after all. But
Right.
then, I saw y'all the next day at, the small little venue where there's maybe like 80 people. And I think y'all even sounded better than what we sounded on the main stage, which means it wasn't just the mushrooms doing the talking. It was the actual band. But yeah, before we get into the album, I know that SubRosa was such a huge formative band for you. And now you've toured North America and the world with Rebecca and this band. So what has that been like for you to kind of have this full circle moment on stage and really start to get out there and explore the world?
Oh, man, I mean, it's been life-changing. It really has, I mean, I've said this before, but if somebody had told me 10 years ago that this is what I would be doing, I would just be, laughing like there's just no way, like you're joking, right? And uh, gosh, being able to play and collaborate with Rebecca has just been a really amazing experience. She's such an incredible songwriter. She's really, in my mind, like a true composer,
Yeah.
like there's people who write music, and then there's people who are born and bred composers, like that is their blood,
Hmm.
like I can write songs, like I can write music, but I really see myself more as a performer who also has those skills, but at the forefront, performing is the thing that, I'm passionate about,
Sure.
and I think for Rebecca, like her real passion is composing, and she hears all sorts of different, pieces of music in her head, and she's able to stack those up. And particularly with Little Bird, the thing I was struck with the most is that instrumentation that you hear on the album. I mean,
Hmm.
there's full string parts, there's woodwinds and brass and harp, just so, and on top of the regular sort of like five member band format, guitars, bass, drums, and all of that. Um, and it is pretty dense on the album.
Yeah,
There
it very
is
much is so.
there's so many layers on the record that sometimes it's a little hard, especially on first listen, to really catch everything
Hmm.
that's there. And a lot of it is kind of subliminal, like there are things like in the mixing process that were in there that we're like, oh, okay, maybe we should like strip this down a little bit. Maybe it's a little much. But then in that process, we would try to strip some parts down, and then it would just be noticeably different in a way that, was not super serving to what was going on in the music. So we would end up adding stuff back in. The
Mm.
mixing process for Little Bird was pretty intense, I will say. But the live rendition of that, when Rebecca decided, she wants to take this thing out on the road, it was, I was very happy to be asked to be a part of that. Billy Anderson, who recorded and mixed the album, played bass. Being a part of that with all of them and figuring out what we are going to capture live
Hmm.
was a whole different process outside of recording the album. Because, you know, for me, like I'm playing the violin parts, but then sometimes I'm playing a cello part, sometimes I'm playing a flute part, sometimes I'm playing a harp part. And then I'm singing vocal harmonies and playing these parts simultaneously. So this was a huge challenge for me going into it because, you know, I have sang a little bit and played in previous projects, but never, not to the extent
I would have
that
had
I am with the
no
King.
idea. I would have had no idea from like watching. I would have thought that you'd been singing like your entire life.
Oh gosh, thank you. No,
Yeah.
it's definitely still a work in progress for me to pull that off, you know, even remotely okay. When we ended up playing at Roadburn, I mean, I think what I would like people to understand is that that performance at Roadburn was our first show
I was
in
gonna
Europe,
ask. Wow, holy shit.
which was so insane. I mean, we were on the main
Uh
stage
huh.
at Roadburn right before Lankum, which is, in my opinion, the heaviest band of all time. I
Yeah.
don't care what anybody says, like Lankum is the best band of all time. But yeah, so doing that was just like it was absolutely insane. You know, we had played literally just a handful of shows stateside before
Hmm.
that. And you know, those shows were like we did get to play with Agalloch, which was awesome,
That's awesome.
at the
Yeah.
Crystal Ballroom. So there was like, you know, I think about 1,500 people there. So that was like the biggest show we had played before that. And then all of the other shows we played before Roadburn, there's maybe like 80, maybe 100 people at those other shows. So going from all of those shows to like, you know, close to like 4,000 people on the main stage at Roadburn was like, holy shit. You
Yeah,
know?
especially in that room that's pretty big, and like I don't know what you can see from the stage or anything like that, because it is even dark when you're just hanging out in there, and the acoustics are so good in there. It was just a perfect place to listen to that album, which I think is why it affected me so much. On top of, you know, having it kind of just like settle in the brain for a couple of listens before Roadburn. But like what you know, you mentioned about Rebecca's being like such like a composer and stuff like that. What struck me is how much lines of certain things from songs, whether it's instrumentals or piano or like the dun, dun, na, na, na from Autumn, just like right in the forefront of your brain for weeks afterwards. Like, despite it being a dense album and a emotionally heavy and album, there's so many catchy lines in there that keep you going back over and over again. But I'm wondering like how much you got to pick Rebecca's brain, and if you even talked to her about, you know, like what, oh hey, you know, I was 15 years old listening to SubRosa and now I'm here. Like, did you have a chance to fangirl out with her about that type of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely gotten to do that intermittently during the time that we've known each other. I mean, we were recording Little Bird like in the latter part of 2020 going
Mm.
into
Oh
2021.
shit. Okay. Cool.
And so yeah, it's been a little bit, we've had a little time, but you know, getting asked to record that, I was just like, oh my gosh. And you know, I've told other people before too, like I had only briefly met her like one time in 2017 before being a part of the album. And I didn't really know, that wasn't enough of an interaction for me to like know what it was going to be like to be with her and to record with her. So I was like very like I got to get my shit together. I have to make sure everything's perfect, you
Yeah.
know, and then when I got into the studio and started, you know, laying down tracks, she was just like completely blown away and was just like, wow, like you just brought this out in a way that I would have never thought was possible and blah blah blah. And I was just like, well, you know, like this project is not, you know, this isn't just another gig for me, you
Mm.
know, this isn't just a, you know, some random band wants me to record on their album. Like this is a highly formative experience for me, and I wanted that to come across before anything of like how important and what an honor it was to, you know, violinists are a dime a dozen in this world. There are a lot of us out there.
Yeah.
She literally could have asked anybody on the planet to do this music, and you know, I was the one that was asked, so that's still not lost on me, you know.
Yeah.
And but you know, on top of that, even without all of that other stuff with SubRosa and who she was, like, just getting the demos and hearing the music, I was just totally struck by it, you know, it totally,
Yeah.
like, arrested me, and just, like, I dropped everything that I was doing to immerse myself in that. I just have not, it's been a long time since I've had any other kind of music, grip me in that way. So yeah, like getting to flesh that out as a live experience. Like, you're not the first person who said that either, of like, I kind of had difficulty getting into the album because it's so dense, there's so much going on, but
Hmm.
then, you know, taking those little things like the dun, 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 or like
Yeah.
all of the other sort of little hooks that are in there that seem to kind of bubble up to the surface
Yeah.
underneath all of these really beautiful, luscious layers. We really wanted to bring that out. Having 5 people in a band, you know, sometimes kind of limits what we're able to do, but we were able to be like, well, we have to have this part. We have to have this part. Maybe we can get away with not having this little hook over here, but we can bring this in here. So it was a totally different process.
Yeah.
But doing that, I feel like it totally brought back some of the heaviness that I think a lot of people, especially when they think of SubRosa and how much people miss SubRosa, like, the thing that they miss the most about it, I think, is that unrelenting heaviness.
Yeah.
And we really wanted to make sure to have that sort of dynamic contrast, you know, of like, yeah, Little Bird is kind of like pretty chill, low dynamic. It's a slow tempo, you know, but then, you know, coming out with, you know, other songs like Hunter 1 or Hunter 2, or Hunter 2 especially, you
Yeah,
know, where
dude.
we're all
It's just the end of
like
that song is
going
like,
nuts at the end, you
dude,
know,
it's
we
the heaviest thing
really,
fucking ever. Oh my God.
yeah. And you know, like, we're at this point, I mean, besides we were able to play the full album at Roadburn, but in most other cases we only have maybe a 30-40 minute set,
Yeah.
so we have to decide what we're going to present in that amount of time. And you know, we want to make sure that people kind of have the full range of emotion in that amount of time. So getting to, you know, experiment with that has just been, you know, for a musician, it's just been such an incredible thing to be a part of. So yeah.
Yeah, and you could yeah, you could tell from that on stage from everybody involved with just like the passion that was exuding from that area of the concert venue. So if you don't know by now, everybody go listen to the Keening's Little Bird. It is so fucking good. And like honestly, the more I listen to it, the more I find things to like, and the more it settles in. And I think it might. Well, we'll see how it goes. Still got about 5 years, but it'll probably be on the list somewhere of one of my favorite albums of this decade. But we still got a while to go. And what you said about Violinist being a dime a dozen, hold that thought, like put a little clothespin in it, because I will eventually want to go out and talk about that very thing at some point while we're talking about everything. But you did, that was an amazing segue into what I'm going to say next, as well as talking about the dynamics of an album, right? To like, you could have an album that's heavy all the time, but then it won't feel as heavy if you don't have those little like interludes or those little bits of calm and quiet and stuff like that. We talk a lot about this on the show all the time. And this album that we're going to listen to today definitely has that, where there's really intense, heavy parts and then some like chill little interludes or musical passages to kind of like recalibrate you and reset you. So, Andrea, today we're going to be listening to Buried Inside's Chronoclast, selected essays on Time-Reckoning and Auto-Cannibalism, which
Yes.
is just fantastic. I literally had never heard about this band or this album until you mentioned it as what you wanted to listen to, which I think is one of the reasons exactly why you wanted to bring this up, is because this is something that may get lost with time since they're not an active band anymore. So tell me about Buried Inside, Andrea, and why you love them and why you love this album so much.
Yeah, that's exactly, you know, why I wanted to bring this up into, you know, back into recent music history or music memory, you know. the thing about this album is that it came out in 2005 on Relapse. So
Mm-hmm.
for those of us who remember 2005, this was like right before, like, and barely before the time that social media really started to take a real tight hold on society in the way that it is now. Like now social media is just like completely interwoven into everything we do. This album came out right before that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to have those like little TBT posts of like, hey, remember this, or but because they're not an active band anymore, you're not like seeing things that harken back to that time. It's just kind of been pushed away. And this is an album, and I have a few albums like this, but this one in particular, it's like it's one of those albums where you've ever listened to an album that is so good that it's kind of hard to listen to unless you're in like a really specific mindset,
Yes, I know
right?
exactly what you're talking about.
Where it's just like, this is, I know what kind of emotions that this is going to bring up. I know what kind of headspace it's going to put me in. Do I want to go down that road right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
And I was still in high school when this came out, but I likely didn't hear it until like a couple years later, when I moved to Portland and kind of became more engrossed in the music scene here, and along with my friend group that I moved here with. But there's so much more to this album than just the music
Mm-hmm.
itself. And the music is obviously incredible, and it's gripping, it's very provocative. Uh, but it is a part of this fabric of a whole presentation. This is an essay on the way that time has gripped society.
Mm-hmm.
And it has, if you look at the lyrics, which and I would suggest for anybody who hasn't listened to this album and they are able to get a hold of a vinyl copy, my opinion is that the proper way to listen to this album is, yeah, pinkies up, everyone. Definitely have, I mean, here's, they've got the album insert
Mm-hmm.
that has all the lyrics on it. It's very like, it really is kind of set up like a book. Like I start thinking about like Les Mis by Victor Hugo.
Hmm.
It's has, Les Mis is kind of, people, think about the musical. I'm thinking about the book
Uh-huh.
and how there is this kind of like plot that is going through the whole novel, but then in between those parts, there's these essays that are talking about the human condition, that are kind of relating back to, well, how are all of these things connected? And this album, I feel like, does that in a similar way, where there's 10 different parts that it's broken into. And not only does it have, I mean, the essay are the lyrics,
Mm-hmm.
but then they are also in the album insert, they're bolstered by all of these other quotes by people like Albert Einstein and George Woodcock and David F. Noble and all of these other people that have kind of, talked about these things over time. And I think it's really interesting to kind of, add those elements together. I haven't seen that really in any other album, you know, artwork or layout before, where it's not only has the lyrics in it, but then it's like bolstered by other people's words about the same thing.
I don't have the vinyl copy. I just have Genius up here because of the access to internet. But it really does make it a different album to go through. Like time is a surrogate religion, time is imperialism, time is commodity. Making all of these songs about how time influences religion and how time influences how we spend our money, and like all of these things that is so pervasive in our. It's like big brain shit that, again, just kind of like we were talking with the Keening, you're not going to get everything on first listen, and it's those repeated listens that really help settle everything down into really, really enjoying this album.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right that, you can have a really enjoyable experience just listening to the music on its own. And I've done that several times. And, it is a kind of a totally different experience to me than sitting there, and because not only are the lyrics really, really interesting and provocative, but the the way that the delivery of the vocals is so a part of the fabric of the music of this too, and it lends to kind of some of the main themes that are happening in the album, and the way that they're kind of, the way that they're delivered, especially if you're looking carefully at the lyrics and listening to how they're delivered in a way that you wouldn't really expect.
Hmm.
And I think that's really interesting. I mean, because I'm an instrumentalist first and foremost. And so a lot of the times lyrics are vocals and lyrics are secondary to me
Sure.
when
Yeah.
I'm
No, I know.
listening to music.
I do the same thing. Like when I listen to music, I'm almost strictly music first, unless there's parts of the lyrics that filter down in me. It's not until like second or third listen that I really try and have the lyrics settle down and figure out their meaning and everything like that.
Yeah. And so the point being with all that is that, without kind of having an understanding of that, you're kind of getting a two-dimensional experience with
Hmm.
this record if you're not really paying attention to what's going on with the lyrics, because it is I mean, it is an essay. It is such a huge part of what's happening. But so much of that is also just captured in the music, again, like you were saying, with not having that in front of you. You can glean a lot from that just by the intensity and the urgency that's found in the music.
The style of music this is very much like, it definitely sounds like something that could be influenced by, like, the early 2000s of Converge, or like that style of metalcore that was just being born at this point. But yet there's also stuff that they did, it's just so angular and so inventive and kind of out of left field that it really, like, I don't know what the fuck I would say anybody sounds anything like this album. Like, this stands alone of something that only Buried Inside, I feel like, could do. And this is me talking about, I had no experience with this band up until like about a month ago or a couple weeks ago, whatever it was.
Yeah, yeah. And to be honest, like I don't really know a lot about a lot of those metalcore bands,
Mm,
but when I listen to Buried Inside, I actually get a little bit more of the sort of uh like origins from like the melodic crust kind of stuff.
okay.
Like I don't know if you're familiar with Fall of Afrafa
Mm-mm.
or bands like that, like the bands that right now that I think are like, the crown jewels of that sort of era of music is like bands like Habak and Lagrimas, from respectively like Southern California and Mexico.
Mm.
They it's a little bit different feel now, but when I hear this music, I kind of get I harken back to that, because there's definitely this sort of like this heavy undertone of that sort of emo melodic
Yeah.
crusty stuff, but it's a little bit more like I don't know, I don't want to say refined version of it, but it's definitely like a more polished version of it,
That's a good word.
where
That's what I would use. Yeah.
just it definitely, or like bands like Envy, or gosh, I'm trying to think of other bands that make me think of this band. It's hard to do
Yeah,
that.
that's exactly the point. Sure.
I mean, I would say even I'm sure it has been heavily influenced by
Sure.
this band.
I
I
could
would be
definitely hear that.
surprised if they weren't, just bands that are thinking about, genre bending in a way that's not overtly obvious,
Hmm.
that and then adding in these, and of course I'm gonna wax poetic about the strings and what the strings do to me and all of that
Once
stuff.
I heard that cello, I was like, ah, this makes sense. I get it.
But that's definitely part of it too, of why I think of a lot of those kind of like melodic crusty bands that I love so much, is because like they're all kind of doing that sort of thing. And I was so, high school version of me was like, I've never heard of stuff like this before. um but yeah, I mean, I think it was a really, just in itself for that time period, a very unique thing that was, and especially for what Relapse was doing at that time too. This was a pretty, between like 2004 to 2007, I would say, like this is a really formative time for Relapse. They're putting out a lot of albums during that time that still hold up and are still some of the most provocative albums to date that people still love and adore. Like I think Leviathan from Mastodon came out around that time. Necrophagous Epitaph came out around that time. High on Fire, Blessed Black Wings, like all of these sort of huge albums that people think of now were all coming out around this time. And this album in particular, I think really stands out of that crowd of albums that were really kind of like going in a certain direction as far as what listeners were really consuming at that point. This was definitely a standalone album during that time.
So I am excited to have someone to hold my hand and show me all the Easter eggs and be like, no, they're talking about Einstein during this part. Look, and like showing the inserts and everything like that. So, all right, everybody, let's do it. Without further ado, this is Buried Inside's Chronoclast. We'll just leave the essays and to the imagination. We'll say that's in parentheses and silent for the rest of the episode. Do you remember how you discovered this band?
Gosh, I think I was just hanging. There's a group of friends that I was hanging out with at the time that I think introduced me to this band, and it makes me think of one of my friends in particular who has since passed away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He really loved this album a lot. His name was Sky, and yeah, he just I think he was the one that introduced me to this album.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yeah, we were all like just moving to Portland at that point. So those are kind of the memories that I have surrounding that.
Well, hopefully the spirit of Sky will be present with us while we're listening to this album.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. This is really cool, like some of the panning that's happening in this introductory track. It already kind of introduces one of the main themes, that bum 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 bum.
It's very
bum,
psychedelic.
bum, bum.
I noticed throughout this album, like I wouldn't call it a psychedelic album, but there are so many touches of really cool production tricks or like fade-ins and fade-outs that make you like it tickles the ears and the brain.
There's definitely like, oh, and then it kind of breaks into the big part here, but
Let's go.
Yeah, there's definitely like a lot of little effects that are going on, like little screeches, and I think like maybe plucking of some piano keys and stuff like that. And the panning is just really, really awesome in that beginning part.
Kind of like what you were saying before. So I listened to this album first, just by the music, and then I went back through and sat down with the lyrics and everything like that. And I had to go back later to read them without any music, without any sounds, without anything else, because of, you mentioned the way that they were written, and it's very, very verbose, very poetic, very much like you can glean what they're saying if you just kind of excavate the words a little bit and get into the subtext and the deeper meaning, which I think, again, adds itself to repeated listens like you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, there's no way that you're gonna find, like, even if you are really adept at like, being able to understand what people are screaming, like,
Yeah.
even if you think you're like if you're good at doing that, you're still gonna miss some stuff in here just because of the nature of the language.
All right, and now we're on Time as Ideology. Yeah, this was the part right here, Andrea, that was like, oh, I hear like a bunch of converge in this part.
Yes,
That, like, yeah.
I can definitely hear that too, for sure.
That part right there.
Yeah.
It's so melodic, which is, again, gets back to kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of this as far as the dynamics between this, where you have that really visceral, distorted part, and then they just bring in melodies back and forth that, and then I guess I think that they'll do stuff like this even quieter throughout the album as well.
Yeah, there's definitely like a few different, I would say like 3 or 4 different themes that are brought back in throughout different parts of the music that are kind of pushing the message in a certain way or in a certain context, kind of pushing it forward. And this is definitely one of them. And it really, this bump, 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 like really definitely is like kind of a marching sort of thing that's going on here. I'm talking about time as ideology, notch by notch, hammer by hammer, escape from freedom. There's a lot of stuff going on here about, the concepts, our concepts of time and the way that has been, put into society, the way that our systems are all revolving around this experience that we have with time.
Yeah, and it kind of like it's the the intro lays out basically what they're going to be talking about through the rest of the album. Again, as an essay, this is the thesis paragraph of the essay. I feel like to tell you like, no, we're going to be getting into the fucking weeds with this shit.
Yeah, and this is just the beginning, right? And what you'll hear is, it sort of dies down a little bit towards the middle, but the end is what you should really pay attention to too. The way that everything sort of builds back, all of these different themes all start to come together. The way that I like to look at it is that there's all of these different things that are being introduced. They all get broken apart and spread out like shattered glass. And the whole album is just the process of gathering all of those little shattered pieces back together. And then it all comes back at the end. It's just really beautiful the way that they wrote this record.
I know, I'm trying not to like applaud. That was also a beautiful way of explaining that album. The bass in this album. I know, like, shout out to a lot of things, like the drummer in this album is really good too, but every time that I listen to this, the bass comes out forefront in my mind, and not just like, oh, we're gonna do some like little flourishes here, but like literally you could hear it keeping the rhythm, you can hear it doing its own thing that still works with the drums and everything like that. And I just like I played bass in a thrash metal band when I was like very, very, very young, so I still have a soft spot for just really good bassists that can hold time but also let the listener know that they're there.
Yeah, there's definitely very specific intention in every little aspect of this album, I think. There's no sense of like, we're just doing this just for the sake of doing it. Like there's intention behind it all. Here's all of the cello stuff that's in here too. So the string player on this album, his name is Mark Molnar. And he not only did, and I didn't really realize this, but there's not only cello, but there's also violin and viola on this album. And he did all of it. And it's really beautiful. The way that, the cello kind of feels like the main string instrument here. But then you hear all of these other kind of little screechy stuff going on in the background that are just part of the layers here that kind of help push this forward too. This is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about as far as like what I've been influenced by. Of, like,
I could hear it.
There's
for sure.
not just like, there's like the main line, but then there's all of this other stuff going on around it that really brings that atmosphere that people think, oh, it's not very important, but if it wasn't there, it would be a completely different experience.
100%, and this gets into the, this is just basically one song that has been cut up by, record labels and whatever, because, we're listening to Time as, where did, I lost it, Time as
methodology.
Methodology.
Oh, no, sorry, as surrogate religion now.
Yeah, well, we're on surrogate religion right now, but that atmospheric part for the people playing the home game was was just its own little track that you didn't even know had turned into from Time is Ideology, and now we're into another song. And you still think that you're on the first track because of how much everything has like segued together and how much it flows.
Yeah. And like the, you know, like the introduction didn't have any vocals in it, but there's still an essay, you know, an essay paragraph on that in the album, as well
really?
as Time is Methodology. That was an instrumental track too, and they talk about the history of watch technology and how if I could, it's a very short sentence that's actually it's just a quote from
yeah, please do.
James Blake. The history of watch technology is a history of eliminating one by one each untidy imperfection, each possible source of imperfection, each possible source of disturbance, and each symptom of change. The watchmaker's challenge has always been to make a material object pure and platonic, immune from the vagaries of matter, the imperfections of the world. And so that is just a quote that you're invited to think about while you're listening to this instrumental track.
That gets me so much into just like the thought process of like a whole creation behind the album, and one of the reasons why I want to start this project, because it's not just about the music, right? And I know we're in a time where everybody's focusing on the music and the singles, and albums are going by the wayside because of attention spans and shit like that. But like that shit, not just thinking about not only the like the painstaking tediousness of writing these songs and connecting these lyrics to it and then presenting it in a vinyl album with the inserts and everything like that, thinking of this whole project as a whole. We talk a lot about timelessness on this show and presenting a piece of art so that it's not just going to be consumed and forgotten about and go by the wayside, but stand up to time. And here we are talking about an album almost 20 years later that from a band that doesn't even exist anymore and probably hasn't existed in almost 10 years at this part too. And because of that insight and that thought process they put into all of their art, it feels like this thing that's even bigger than just themselves or the music, you know? And I think that you're talking about being influenced by a lot of that. I can see that in the projects that you're in. I mean, we haven't even really talked about Exulansis really, which is your main band, given the like all the other stuff that you've been doing. But certainly I can see a lot of that and a lot of that ethos and thought process and approach to atmosphere and serving the song and adding other elements that are going to buoy the main thought process of the song or the main melody of it. And I can definitely see that that you were influenced by that.
Yeah, and again, like we were talking about Rwake earlier, like I didn't, you know, when I kind of came back and revisited this album, it was yet again another experience years later after doing the things that I've been up to lately, like not realizing exactly how much I was influenced by that music. Like I think a lot of people are influenced by things subconsciously. I certainly am.
Yeah.
You know, and just like not really realizing until I put myself in a position where I'm revisiting something from the past, like, and thinking about like, oh shit, like I didn't even know that this was something that I was thinking about, or just like, you know, sometimes when people write music, they're like, I know I've heard this before, like, whether they're stealing a riff or they're stealing a vibe,
exactly.
You know, like you might not necessarily know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And I mean, definitely like, especially the string parts in this, I'm like, oh yeah, like I was totally ripping these guys off when I recorded the first demo with Exulansis, and I like didn't even know that I was doing that, but now I know.
Yeah, imitation's the highest form of flattery, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And ignorance will keep you from the lawsuits coming.
Yeah,
you know, just
exactly.
I didn't know, right?
Yeah, I had no idea. Sorry, you know.
I was stank facing while you're talking about this, because the end of this part right here, just. Oh my god, like not only is it like sludgy and stanky, but then they've got these like higher kind of dissonant chords right here that are just like really hammering home this part.
Yeah, it's so good. And like I won't sit here and read like all of the lyrics, you know, but I'll just say the last sentence of Time is Surrogate Religion is hell-bent on standardization, the wheel keeps turning and we all turn with it. And so this is the line. You have to take that little line and just think about this is what everything is being pushed towards in the music in this particular track.
And if I may, there was a part in Time as Ideology that I really liked that kind of, again, that kind of thesis statement where it says prognosis. Ideologies are habits of thought that defy thought and enable people to avoid thought. Airborne contagions, communicable plagues, towing the weary downriver like rudderless wrecks, and we're all sick with them. Like,
And
what?
we're all
What?
sick
We
with
are
them.
all sick with them. I hate thinking. I hate ideologies. I just want to be a happy little hobbit in my home with my weed and my cheese. That's it.
Absolutely. Like, why should I have to think about anything when someone has thought about it for me? You know,
Consciousness is a curse.
Yeah. Okay, we have to listen to this part because this is where shit starts to transition a little bit. We're being introduced with a different theme here.
And here's that bass, the bass that I'm talking about right here to put that in. Please feel free to tell me to shut the fuck up if you need to.
This is that moment because this is the part that really sticks out the most to me, or one of them. And
It's like I love that falling melody.
I do too, a lot. The lyrics are going to come back here in a really intense way.
Yeah, the ending of this song is really fucking intense too, as far as like lyrically wise.
Here, it's an imperial narrative.
You know what this song reminds me of? Like a band like Chat Pile or something like that. You know, I can hear a lot of that type of band in this.
There's definitely that rawness is there, you know, underneath all of this really detail-oriented instrumentation.
I love
that rawness there.
Yeah, and the way that these vocals are produced too, where it's just got that muffled little production on. I don't know what that's called in production world or not, but yeah, it's just really hearing someone just scream, so it sounds like their lungs are being shredded, but yet it's muted and quiet behind these like really soft instrumentals is. It's again another like every little detail orient of this thing that you have in here is great. So I'm really happy that you turned me on to this album because I've been listening to it a lot over the past couple weeks and it's been an amazing time.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it when then it comes back into this big moment here, but one of my favorite things is when vocals, like when vocals are mixed in a way to where it's not always front and center, you know, when it's able to kind of hang back a little bit and then have certain moments where it comes back into the forefront. This album is a really beautiful example of that. Bum, 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 bum. This is a theme that we've heard already that's being brought back in to reiterate something else in the lyrics.
And it's got that swinging, like 3/4 time signature on it that really just makes you want to lurch with this song. This is the lyric right here.
Yeah.
Feed them a thread that leads to a string. They follow the string until it leads to a rope. And from that rope, every vestige of what was will be hung by the neck.
Yeah, this track really stands out to me. I wouldn't say more than any others, but I remember hearing this album for the first time and having this particular one be the one that really was like, oh shit, you know?
Yeah, great sequencing with this album too, as you would think with an album that basically is, you know, a concept album meant to be listened to from front to back.
Yeah.
Where in your musical journey did you find this band? Like, had you been already introduced to like extreme metal and black metal and stuff like that when listening to this, or was this kind of more of a gateway to find that type of stuff?
I was definitely like in the beginning stages of listening to metal. I mean, I had been kind of delving into it for a couple years before, but I was definitely still kind of in this place of searching and not really knowing what was out there. So this definitely kind of changed my perspective about what metal could sound like, you know, just because of what I had been, you know, previously exposed to. It was another one of those kind of, you know, things like I mean, SubRosa came much later for me, but
Sure.
this album was like one of the first I'd heard with strings on it, you know. And I had not been playing in bands at all when I heard this music. I was still going to school and learning how to play the violin, you know.
Yeah.
Mostly playing a lot of classical, like I would be like playing classical music during the day and then like coming home to my like punk rock squat, you know, with like 13 other people and like, you know, partying and listening to metal at night. Like that was my experience like during the time that I was discovering this music.
I love everybody turn down the Operation Ivy. I've got to practice my violin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And now we're in Time as Objection, which we had Reintroduction, which was that's where for me it was really like, yeah, okay, I hear the cello, I hear the strings, I understand why Andrea picked this album.
Yeah, that interlude with the cello and the strings is just really, really beautiful. So this, if we were listening to this on the record, I think this might be the first track on the B side.
Okay.
So we start to kind of see, we can kind of hear the intensity sort of building here in a different way than we heard a few songs ago.
Which again is another reason why Reintroduction, that intro before that was really important, because if you had done that after the last song that we just heard, like you needed that minute or two just to catch your breath after that last track with how like intense it was, and that makes like this part right here again, their way of playing with like staccatos and like emphasizing certain notes is really, really fucking cool.
Yeah, I love how they kind of introduce the form of the vocal structure before the vocals come in. As any crime shows the fragility of the law, as any corpse shows the fragility of the body, time bears the fragility of the symbolic order, the violent revolt of being.
Time is the defacer, like that's how the song starts, and they repeat that a couple of times. Like these guys are on some shit that it's just mainlining reality in their veins to be like, no, everybody, do you want to know exactly how much the world fucking sucks and how we're just pawns into some scheme that we don't even know?
Yeah, it's so brutal. And like what I was saying before, like there's really a lot of like prophetic stuff going on here, you know, like.
Yeah, you know what? It's amazing that you brought that up, because I had forgotten to write that down, but you're right. You listen to this album in 2024, and not only are you like, wow, this is as timely as it could probably ever be, you're like, they're talking about shit that we know have been problems for a really long time, but are now like really, really, really big problems, which, you know, who knew that if we ignored these things that people were yelling and screaming about, that they'd get even worse?
Right. And in what way they would get worse, you know, like I think, you know, at this point, you know, 9/11 was only like a handful of years before this came out. And we were really just like seeing just what ways the world was changing in that context.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really, you know, make up for a lot of the way that capitalism and hyper-capitalism has taken hold. And I don't think any of us anticipated how much our lives would change just based on that concept alone of like, now that, I mean, we were living in that 9 to 5, 40-hour a week, you know, work schedule or whatever, like that's always kind of been the norm in our lifetime. But the, you know, the way that that's taken hold in this day and age of like, if you don't do that, you will be not only punished by society, but you just simply will not survive.
You will not be able to live. And I know, like, obviously you've talked about this before, and I know that you, had your own housing challenges and stuff like that through the years of trying to grind and be a musician and just like pay the bills because, bad shit happened earlier in your life. And then you're trying to play catch up and you had to work because it was a necessity, not because that you wanted to or anything like that. And I know that there's, especially in this day and age, where like cost of living is so high and just like working turnover is so huge and just like no, if you go outside of your house it's just like automatically $50 just stepping outside your door no matter what.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people know like the type of stuff that you went through, like, not having housing and having to work your ass off just to fucking like get a meal and have a roof over your head and everything like that. And I think in this day and age that a lot more people will relate to that, especially because like just normal people were out on their asses during the pandemic because jobs weren't able to be had, right? And it was nothing having to do with their fault or anything like that, but they still fell a victim of this, capitalist imperialist god that we live under. You obviously started grinding early due to financial necessity. Do you still feel like you're wired that way because you had to do it at such a young age that now you just can't get away from that? Or have you found a way that now that you're a little bit more settled and have your kind of career going that you're able to get away from that kind of mentality and you don't feel like you need to always be grinding to bring the bread home?
I mean, I kind of vacillate a little bit because, getting back to what you were saying before, like, nowadays people are struggling and it's not because they're not working their asses off. Like, now we're in a position where people are working 9 to 5, 50 hours a week, and that still isn't enough for people.
Yeah,
to
sometimes even with
survive.
multiple jobs.
Yeah. And, at some point you have to come to terms with, okay, if this is what it takes for me to survive, having to work this many hours for this amount of pay to pay for this thing, this roof over my head, or my means of getting around, like you have to make a choice of how you are going to spend that time.
Mm-hmm.
And not most of us don't have those choices, most of us find what we can do that is going to make ends meet, and we have to put everything else aside to make that happen. For me, I have accepted that there's always going to be an element of sacrifice to what I do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certified to teach K through 12 music in public schools. I could very well go and get a full-time teaching job right now. And I wouldn't be making great money, but I'd be making better money than I'd be making right now.
Yeah.
But if I go and do that, I would pretty much have to stop doing music almost completely, or I would have to cut down to a point where I would not be able to do the things that I'm currently doing. So I've really had to like make a choice of like, all right, like I'm not going to be able to afford to do this thing right now, but I can go and tour Europe, and that's cool. I'm not making a ton of money doing that either.
Yeah.
But
But you get to do it.
And yeah, and of course there's like, that's an extremely privileged position to be in. And that's not lost on me.
Mm-hmm.
But there definitely is a huge amount of sacrifice that comes with that. And so it makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of people, especially musicians, that will do this for a little while, and then
Mm-hmm.
they'll get to a point where the financial necessity of being stable financially is a lot more important than playing music in a band or whatever, or creating art. So for me, like, I've dedicated my whole life to music. You know, not just playing music, but being involved in working in live theater and working in music venues, you know, teaching music, helping other people facilitate their own musical journey. Those are the only ways, being able to do all of those things and really dedicating all of my time to music in some form or another is really the only way I've been able to make this work. If I did it passively, I wouldn't survive, you know. I've had to, so that kind of grind that you were talking about in the beginning, it's like, yeah, I was really instilled with a really intense work ethic when I was a kid from who I was raised by. And I probably didn't plug that work ethic into the things that they wanted me to, you know, but
Yeah.
I still have that instilled in me. And so, you know, going back to, you know, we have to make a choice of how we want to spend our time on this planet in a way that, you know, is not going to be completely soul sucking, but also make sure that you have what you need, all of your basic needs to survive.
Yeah.
So I'm still in the midst of that, you know, like I think that I have the tools that are necessary to, you know, make this work.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's always work to be done. And
Always.
I don't think, is that the end?
No, we got some songs left. We've got, this
yeah.
is the end of Time as a Commodity, which basically,
What a perfect
literally,
song to be playing while we were talking.
I didn't want to interrupt you while you were saying that because you were saying such good stuff, but I was like, yo, like the people who are listening to this with the album track layered underneath and everything like that are going to be like, fuck yeah, that's amazing. But I think it's
brutal.
Yeah, it's so important what you said, though, because I know a lot of people, whether they're musicians or artists or just following some sort of passion project in this day and age, right? I think a lot of people will relate to that idea of making sacrifices in order to do the thing that you really, really want to love. And it's what you said about the music not being as important as like surviving or life or, you know, being able to support yourself or whatever it is. That's exactly what happened to this band. They got to a point where they were like, look, we love making music. We're not breaking up. We're going on indefinite hiatus or whatever. But I believe like some members had families. Some members had other jobs in like the music industry. And it just became not their focus anymore as much as they wanted to do it. But they're like, look, realistically, we know we're only selling like this many records and it costs us X amount of money to go out on tour, which we may be losing money to do that, let alone making any. So like sacrifices had to come, and Buried Inside as an entity and as a band became one of those sacrifices.
Yeah, I mean, I think another reason why I like this band so much is that I still have the mysticism of not really knowing who they are.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, it's like I've been fortunate to kind of meet some of my quote unquote like idols from the past, you know, and that completely like changes your whole perspective of those people and the music and stuff. And like
Sure.
I don't know these guys at all. I know that they're from Ottawa, Canada. And I don't know really anything about them. And as far as the reasoning for them not being an active band anymore, I have nothing to say about that. But I think that in my mind, the mysticism that I've made up in my brain about this band is that, you know, after coming out with this album, there's more that could be said, but they put so much into this. Like, I feel like coming out with something like this and then just being like, all right, we said what we needed to say, like, peace.
It's such a power move.
Like, it's such a huge flex. Like, I love it so much. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot that people have to take into consideration now, you know. I mean, I think that's never not been the case, but I think nowadays especially.
Yeah, it seems very much more heightened nowadays, just given everything else that's been going on the past 4, 8 years, 10 years, whatever it's been.
Yeah, and it just like, you know, it's a scary time for musicians right now, for sure. Like it
Yeah.
was always like being a musician has always been kind of like a fringe thing, especially like in the like sort of rock and metal, you know, those sort of entertainment sectors. It's always been kind of a fringe thing, but nowadays it's like you're seeing like all of these huge artists having to cancel tours because of lack of ticket sales, or
Yeah.
not knowing that they're going to have this amount of overhead and not be able to make that back. Like that says a lot to a bunch of you know, us underlings down here that are like, well, you know, like we can't, it's financially virtually impossible for most
Yeah.
people, and that's not a reflection of the music that they're making. There's people that are making really incredible music out there that just don't have the means to put it out there, you
Yeah.
know.
One of these days, I will win the lottery, and I will. My partner and I talk about this a lot, where we talk about bringing like patrons back. Or we're just like, okay, whoever you are, we're gonna give you whatever money that you need to just like live. Just all your bills are paid for, all your shit is paid for, but go and do your art because it makes me happy, and I want you to thrive and survive and everything like that. So
Yeah,
I'll
I
be
mean, that's
starting.
how all the classical composers survived, you
Exactly.
know?
Yes.
They're
Exactly.
all just like people like us that were kind of like, you know, just on the fringes of society, and just so happen to like find some like rich dude, like some rich king or some rich, like, you know,
It was usually like the
whatever.
fourth son of like the Earl of Westchester, who has no authority anywhere, but yet has all of this money to be able to just like throw around at someone. So, yeah, I'll be starting the applications for the Stay Puft Lottery Fund here in a little bit.
Yes. Okay, we're on Time is Resistance Now, which is the last track. And I just have to, I am going to read this whole
Please
last little
do.
paragraph here. So, time politics are power politics. No denial, no exception. The fallacy of science and tech is its complete objection. All technologies are biased. This the decade is new, bringing revolutionary backwash that flooded more power turbines for the clockmakers, the foremen, the officials, and the mega machine. But the seams will split, the myth will spoil, the monolith will crack, the soil will turn. The seams will split, the myth will spoil, the monolith will crack, the soil will turn. Death comes in time, death comes with time. And that's the end of the album. Those last few lines that repeat themselves get repeated over and over and over at the end.
With that rhythm of dun, 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 dun,
Yeah.
dun, 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 so good.
And you know, I was talking over a lot of it, but what's happening musically is that all of those little themes that we heard before all kind of slowly get added into this layer, along with that sort of marching rhythm that's going on while those lyrics are being said over and over and over again. It's kind of bringing everything all back together again. It's just an incredible record, and you know, something that I aspire to, as far as, you know, not only writing like, I think concept albums are really cool in general, but
Same.
just having that sort of that common thread that goes through something is, I think, a really important aspect. And I haven't really talked about this, but it does remind me of like, it does kind of have like a symphonic sort of structure to it too, as far as the way that the sort of, I think of each song as like a different movement of this big thing, you know, in the same way that like a lot of like, I mean, I would say every symphony or every, like, you know, classical piece that's in that sort of like sonata form, like has one or two, maybe three like main themes that get introduced almost immediately. And then what happens is that those themes kind of get like chopped up into little pieces, and then they become variations of themselves. And you can kind of hear a little bit of it in this other sort of hook. And then at the end, everything kind of, oh, remember this? Like, you remember that from 40 minutes ago? Well, it's back here now in a totally different context, or maybe the key has changed, or maybe the tempo is different, or whatever. Maybe it's in different, time signature, whatever. But I definitely feel like there is an element of that. Whether or not these guys had that intention or not, I don't know. Because again, I don't know them, and I love that I don't know who they are.
Yeah, sometimes you just want to remain ignorant, right? I have albums where it's just like I only have the one album from this band that I listen to. I don't know who the fuck plays on it. I don't know what the fuck they did before or after it, nor do I care. It's just like got that one, and that mysticism you said will stay with me forever.
Yeah, I will say that the album that they did before this one is called Suspect Cemetery. It's also a great album. And I really need to revisit it, but this is the album that really truly stands the test of time in my head.
Yeah.
And I don't know any of them personally, but when you asked me to do this podcast and I thought about what I wanted to do, I started to kind of redo the deep dive into this, and I was just looking at the liner notes and being like, wow, like I have no idea who these people are. And then I saw Mark Molnar's name, who did the cello, violin, viola on the record. So I was like, I'm gonna look this guy up, like did the whole like Metal Archives thing, and I decided to reach out to him and was like,
Oh, wow.
hey, like, I was like, my name's so and so, and I do violin stuff on some stuff, and I just, wanted to let you know that I was asked to do this podcast, and I was planning on talking about this album, and I started to, without knowing your name or anything, like I started to realize like how much I was influenced by you and your playing on this record. So thank you for that. And then I kind of just invited him to be like, I'd be curious, like if you have any insight about if there's anything you want to say about this album, like what it meant to you, like
holy shit.
And if not, it's cool too. Like you don't have to respond at all. I just wanted to like, put that out there. And then like a few hours later, I get this huge response back, and I was like, oh my gosh, it was so cool. So I mean, I won't read all of it, but
I want to know. Look, that's amazing. Hey, you're doing my legwork for me. Thank you so much. Can I be a co-host here at some point? But also, like, I'm just so glad you felt compelled to reach out to him in order to do that. Like, what do we, again, another like circular moment here,
Yeah, I mean,
please tell me what he said.
Yeah, I mean, because like there's like a few of us that do string stuff in this world of music, and I always like to kind of like try to connect, and sometimes I've like scared people off, and sometimes I've become really, really dear, beloved friends, and yeah, not knowing anything about him, I was like, yeah, so he writes back like, Andrea, it's very kind of you to reach out to me. I've been following your work with Exulansis for the past year. Love what you're doing. So I was like, oh my God, first
he
off,
already knows who I am.
You're like, I totally like freaked out over that. But he had just some amazing words to say about the album. I will read a little bit of it. So BI's Chronoclast is a very special album to me. I'm very lucky to have worked with them on all of their albums that have any strings on them. They are dear friends of mine, and I still see them every week. They are truly good people, and I still feel tremendously fortunate that they included me in these records. I think what they have achieved with this album and Suspect Cemetery is very special to me. And so they wrote all the albums themselves, and kind of hermetically in their own rehearsal space, editing things down, questioning every detail and passage until they were happy, which is just so obvious to me.
Yeah.
Listening to this, and then he mentions the bass player. Steve is a great bass player to carry melody and is significantly influenced by Cliff Burton. I could say that.
I could hear that for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Andrew Tweedy and Matthias Palacios Hardy on guitars have very different influences and styles, but worked hard to play to each other's detail, which I can definitely hear that as well. There's a lot of sort of like intermingling moments with the guitars that they both seem to be sort of, I think of it like when instruments are interacting like in a conversation,
Yeah, very much so.
and you can tell that it's not just like a doubling of the same guitar player. There's definitely, you know, two different players happening there. Um, Nick is a kind, gentle, and deeply sensitive in his intellect and care for the larger craft and research of the lyrics and the arc of the message that he was working through in his share. Mike is an incredible drummer, and his perspective of what that drumming should bring to the music is rare. Mike is also one of the most remarkable editors and grounded thinkers I've ever met when it comes to guiding and revising what they were doing. I suspect that a great deal of the structure came from his attention to detail and his awareness of what they were doing in relation to the larger culture of heavy music that they were a part of.
Wow.
But so he said that's his own assumption, and he never
Sure.
really talked to them about that, but that was just kind of what he gleaned. He recorded all the parts in one day with the strings, you know,
Hmm.
just kind of sat in a room with all of his instruments and just started layering and layering, which, you know, I've been there, and it's kind of a weird experience to, like, you know, just like kind of be in your own little bubble and like kind of be in like a laboratory where everyone is sort of like watching you be, you know,
You
do
feel like
your
a
work,
mouse is
you
behind the
know?
cage or something like that, like getting poked at and stuff.
Yeah, totally. But you know, from what I can hear in Mark's stylistic approach is that, you know, he's obviously classically trained player, but also has a huge influence with improv.
Hmm.
And so I think most of what was written here was on the spot improv.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
so, and you know, when it came time for me to record, I came in, heard what they had settled on in their writing structure and parts, and I did all of my parts in an afternoon. I just stayed in the room with my instruments, and they rolled take after take, and I layered it all on the spot. I think we all took for granted how smooth it was, but looking back, that is a testament to everyone's respect and love for each other as friends, which,
Mm.
yeah, that's, I would definitely
Yeah,
say
100%.
that.
Yeah, and I know that for a fact too. Like when singers, musicians, anybody just feel comfortable in the space that they're in around, whether it's in the studio around their mates or whatever it is, they're going to get better performances and it's going to flow a lot smoother. Obviously, than if they're uncomfortable. Who knew?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean that's a huge part of it, you know. But yeah, it really you know, he doesn't say it specifically, but from what it seems like, I think, and I've been in this position too, where like a band will ask me to record with them, and I'm like, well, you guys do your thing, like, you know, make sure that you have all the parts down that you want to be there once the violin or once the strings kind of get introduced to it, because like if I'm hearing like if a band gives me a demo that doesn't have all the guitars or doesn't have all the vocals, then my brain is going to be like, oh, I'm going to fill in all of these missing pieces that I'm not hearing, and then later on they add this vocals and guitars that might like end up doing the exact same thing or doing
Mm.
something that ends up kind of clashing with whatever I'm doing. So a lot of the time I'm like, yo, just send me your kind of like almost finished, what all the parts that are going to be present, so I can kind of, you know, sprinkle the cherries on top after
Yeah,
that. I mean,
as opposed
unless,
to trying to
and
like work it out for them or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, unless that those things aren't going to be there, and you know, then the violin or whatever stringed instrument is going to be used to kind of like, you know, be the main voice in this particular area. That's a different thing entirely. But you know,
Hmm.
as far as this album goes, it's like I definitely think that the strings are a very pivotal part of the music, and not so much in the like it is like crucial necessarily in the like the overall structure of the music,
Hmm.
but especially a lot of these transitional parts, there would be such a huge hole left without it. And I think that they definitely, and again, this is just speculation on my part, but I think that they really kind of like, you know, pushed the window open and was like, this is a part in the music where we're gonna have some breeze come in and we're gonna get some fresh air, and maybe this is a moment where the strings can kind of, you know, be showcased and have some other things sort of, you know, transition us into the next thing that's happening. And then on top of that, there's still a lot of strings that are present that you can't hear super well in the rest of like the main chunks of the music, which is also something that is really, you know, important for me. Like, you know, I mean, people have heard me talk about what I do with Exulansis. Like, strings are normally pretty typically like used as like a novelty or an embellishment of the main thing that's happening. And, you know, I like to present the violin and in metal music as like, you know, one of the main core instruments without it sounding like gimmicky and cheesy. And maybe I still make it gimmicky and cheesy in some ways, maybe
No, I
most
don't
of the
think
time.
so.
But you know, like, but this music I think is a perfect example of that, you know, where there are moments where it really shines and that it is really just like critical for this particular part, but then it also becomes a part of the, you know, the regular fabric, the main, like the, what I call like the meat and potatoes of the music, you know, like
Yeah.
the main riffs, the main like big giant moments that are happening in the music. Like it is just as much a part of that as anything else. But you have to really listen for it, I think. And so I think that, you know, for me, like hearing this and being like, well, what if all of those string parts, you know, started bubbling up even more up into the, you know, the surface of it all. I had to really thank him to be like, you know, this was, you know, influential to me in ways that I really had no idea
That's
until
so
later.
cool. I'm so
So
glad that you just reached out to him. You know, send the email, everybody. Worst they could say is no. Fuck it. Like, but then you got a big ass response from this person who has influenced you for so long and got some incredible insight that I also now get to steal and make my little series look even better by comparison and stuff like that. So I hope you guys get to work together in the future, if that's at all possible. You know.
it's funny because one of the last things he says is, "It's a pleasure to hear you're playing. I hope we can do something together someday." And I was
Yeah, all right. So you heard
like,
it here first,
that would
everybody.
be that would be really cool. Yeah, I was just like, I was blown away by like just his like generosity of time to be
Yeah.
like to take that moment to like, I didn't read everything he wrote, but just like the, you know, he really took some time to like explain the whole recording process, like how great these guys are, and you know how you know, and they're all still friends. Like it's not like it wasn't like some like shitty breakup where like
Yeah.
nobody's friends anymore. Like they're all like still close. They live in a fairly small community, and you know, and so it kind of reinforces more of what I was saying of like, I really feel like they said what they needed to say with this album. And sometimes I think that's better to have one or two like great works like that you've put all of this time and effort into, rather than like churning out, you know, some half-assed piece of thing that just for the sake of, you know, continually churning out content, which, you know,
Yeah.
maybe that's a little too like controversial to start talking about, but
No, we talk about this a lot. We could go down a fucking whole rabbit hole, Andrea, if we wanted.
you know, I think that that is kind of a symptom of the world we're living in right now too, where it's like, I think people like on the internet being like, you have to put out a single like every week,
You have to
like you
write for
have
the
to,
algorithm. Yeah.
yeah, you have to post on Instagram like 3 times a day, like all of this stuff. And you know, it's like, I mean, maybe this is just a symptom of me being like a millennial or whatever, but like I just like, you know, no one is not susceptible to like, you know, instant gratification and stuff like that.
Of course.
But I have a really hard time. I'm actually really envious of people that can be so prolific to just like churn out material and songs and art, like it's just like breathing, like it's like, you know, coughing for them. And
Yeah.
I've never been that person. Like I
Mm-mm.
have to really put myself in a very intentional space to not only create something, but then prepare it to be released out into the wild. Like it's a huge undertaking, and you know, something I've gotten like a little better at over time as far as the time management part of it is
Yeah, of
concerned.
course, which only comes with
Um,
experience, you know?
yeah, it really only comes with experience, but I'm just like amazed by people who are just like, well, like wrote a new song 30 minutes ago and it's already out on the internet. Like I'm just like blown away. Like
Yeah, you fucking talented dicks.
you know, like this kind of art that we're talking about, this album, like it kind of talks about that whole idea of like, you know, we are you know, the cogs in the machine or whatever, but like we still at the end of the day, like we have a choice of, you know, what we are choosing to engage with and to what extent we're engaging with it, you
Hmm.
know, and sometimes it's easy to forget that when we have that obligation to be like, this is my business, this is my livelihood, like I have to do everything I can to make this work and I have to do all of these things to keep it going, and we get lost in that mire of, you know, I have to sell myself 100% as a commodity, and time as a commodity, you
Time
know,
is a
like that.
commodity.
um I've been thinking about all of those things a lot, like especially after the pandemic and stuff. Like we're all at this point now where it's like we're not just selling our time, we're selling ourselves, every single part of ourselves, you
Yeah.
know, and no matter where we are on the spectrum of privilege, you know, there's something that everybody is having to sacrifice in themselves to survive right now. I could be making a lot more money doing other things, but how much time do we really have left, and how do you want to spend this time, this precious amount of time that we have, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I'm lucky that I'm able to make music. It definitely, like, you know, uh it's still difficult as far as like trying to make ends meet and stuff like that. But in my mind, it's like I would rather be poor and still get to do this than be financially stable and not get to do this, because then my quality of life would be to such a point where I wouldn't want to live anymore anyway, you know.
I am so glad that you have made that decision too. Not that I'm not so glad that you're poor and overworked and like all of that other stuff, right? But I'm glad that myself and so many other people can listen to your music, and they can listen to the musicians that you play with, whether it's the Keening, whether it's Panopticon, whether it's Mark in the future, you know, whether it's going to be. And yeah, I just thank you for choosing that path, because people like me really, really, really do appreciate it. Myself and many, many, many other people appreciate you doing what you're doing and following this path that is obviously, you know, you're on something, because, you know, it's leading you to Europe. It's leading you to play with Rebecca Vernon. It's leading you to play with your own band, and it's leading you to, you know, connect with a musician that was so formative to you that you didn't even know it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's unbelievable. It really is. Like, and I was talking to a dear friend of mine the other day about, like, you know, how did we get so lucky, you know?
Mm,
And I think it is like it's about following your heart, you
yeah.
know. It's like when we do that, it really is, you are heading in the right direction, you know, when you're really listening to the thing that is calling out in your own spirit, you know. And when we were actively ignoring that, we're going down, you know, a path that is, you know, resistant to everything that you want in life.
Yeah.
And there are consequences to that too, just as much as following your heart and, you know, having sacrifices along with that too. But I think that's the only way, you know.
Yeah, I agree, and hopefully people will be able to do that no matter their circumstances, and know that, hey, you know, there are sacrifices to be made sometimes, and it can always get better. Trust me, I was at a really shitty spot in 2020, as a lot of other people were, and there were times where I was like, how the fuck am I ever going to get out of it? It is impossible. There's no way out. But there is. You just unfortunately have to take it day by day, and one step at a time and just like do a little thing every day. So to wrap this up, I know you mentioned like with you were saying how Mark is you were so surprised taking the time out of his day to give you that big long thing. We can say that time as an appreciation to see it on topic over here, right? And so the last thing I wanted to bring up is so he mentioned Exulansis. We've talked about it a little bit before, but I know so this is your your big creative project, the one that you not just like, hey, can you like find a violin part for this one? Like you're actively involved in making the music together with them and everything like that. And you mentioned with Mark how, both how the violin and the viola world is small, but also violins are a dime a dozen. They just get people to slap some things over something and then call it a day. But you're actively working, like you said, to make the violin its own meat and potatoes instrument that isn't just an accompaniment to a large metal band, but actually a part of that, which there aren't a lot of roadmaps to do that. So I'm just curious on how you've kind of just navigated that, just being like your own member of this band to do this type of music that isn't really presented in the way that Exulansis puts it a lot. Does that make sense? Am I just like rambling? Do you know what I'm trying to ask you?
Totally, yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess I'll start first by saying I'm an eldest daughter, so um, so I've always kind of been, in a position where I feel like I need my voice to be heard. But I'm not always the very best at letting people know that I have something to say. Uh, or I could start to say something and some other voice might be a lot louder than mine in the room. And then I kind of like feel like I have to sort of quiet down and not talk and just listen to whatever is being said. And then maybe I'll have a chance to react to that. Maybe I won't. So there's that kind of like persistent sort of pattern in my life where there's definitely things that I want to talk about and want to say, but I don't necessarily have the words for them, so they come out in my music. And with Exulansis, Ellis Ray is the founder of the band. They started it with my youngest brother Mark Morgan, who plays drums. And they kind of had their own thing going on with like that was kind of more of a like sort of like grindcore-y, crusty, sludgy, doomy, black metal-y thing. And then they eventually asked me later on to if I wanted to throw some strings on it. It was that situation where it's like you want to just throw some strings on this.
Incredible.
And at the time I was like, oh, like I feel like because I was like, again, in the back of my mind, like Buried Inside with the cello, or Fall of a Fraffa with their cello, or some of those other kind of like sort of crusty bands that like had a little bit of that element to it that made it like sort of like a little bit sad and melodic. Like I wanted to do that. So even though I was already a violin player at this point, I like started fucking around with the cello. And so you hear this like really shitty like cello on the first demo, and that's literally just like me like experimenting around with that. But as we, started to play more music together, it was like, hey, like there's a lot of like, as we were writing more songs together, it's like, hey, there's a lot of like musical ideas here that like I really want to be able to flesh out that I am physically unable to do on the cello, because I'm not a cellist. Like I'm just a person with a cello that's trying to play cello and I can't really play it very well. So I'm going to switch back to violin. And once I made that switch back to violin and started implementing that into Exulansis, there was only one. Ellis is the only guitar player. And then we have bass as well. But a lot of these ideas that they're writing, it's like it really lends to having like another lead instrument, to sort of get all of these ideas out there, especially in like kind of like a melodic black metal doomy sort of thing that was starting to materialize in Sequestered Sympathy. And so it really just became like, in a way, like a lot of people think of it as like a second guitar, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it is, to be honest. Like, I mean, it's a lot of like the same thing, but like there's just a lot of different approach to that. Like I might be playing some of like a lot of similar harmonies, but bowing the instrument as opposed to strumming it, you know, can really give it a lot of different texture. And in my mind, it just kind of led to this idea of like, well, this should be happening more often, you know? And like, you
Yeah.
know, there are plenty of other bands that have violin in, like My Dying Bride or
Hmm.
Panopticon
Yeah,
or,
I
you know,
Navel of
other bands.
Ascaris is on the top of mind. Where like that's another one. I think probably the best example I can think of one that it's not just the violin is there to be like accoutrement to everything else. It is its own like specific thing, but in a way different way because than Exulansis. Because you're right, I would think of it as just like another guitar or like helping to like hold up the guitar in this like single part of a whole type of deal, but also it has its own legs that it can stand on as well.
Yeah, and then like, you know, Ellis and I kind of like bounce back and forth between like, you know, they'll be playing the leads and I'll be kind of like playing the pads underneath that. And then like in certain transitions, I'll take the lead and then they'll be kind of playing the more rhythmic parts, you know,
Hmm.
and I like that structure too, where like it's kind of annoying to me when like there's two guitar players in a band and only one of them's playing the leads and the other one is only playing rhythm. Like I like it when people kind of switch back and forth
Do you hear
and
that, James Hetfield?
yeah, exactly. You know, it's like, you know, everybody, I mean, like, and in an orchestra, like, you know, the violin is a lot of the time considered the meat and potatoes. It's the, you know,
Sure.
there's two sections of violin in a symphony. There's the first violin section, there's a second violin section. And you can think of that as the lead guitar and the rhythm guitar, right? Like they're
Hmm.
doing a lot of that. But even in that structure, sometimes the second violins will take the melody and take off with it. And first violins are playing something in like a high register, but it's still like in the background of what the melody actually is, and vice versa, where they play things together. And I do like to do some unison parts too,
Of
like
course, yeah.
in some of the main riffs that I'm like, oh, this is the riff, this is the thing that we have to say. Like, I'll take that higher octave and bring it out, you know, like,
Mm.
and I think that the violin is really great for things like that, like where like guitar tone kind of like invokes its own sort of spirit for metal players or
Yeah.
metal like metal consumers as well, like metal listeners. Like there's a certain flavor to that, but then when you implement the violin into that same structure in a way that people haven't heard before, they think of it in a different way of like, oh, like I never thought of it that way before, you know, like,
Yeah.
and they could be saying the same thing or something slightly different. But I think ultimately that's kind of the message I want to get through is that, like, you know, there is a lot of crossover here and that it shouldn't, nobody should be, you know, put in that novelty corner forever. There's a moment for everybody to come forward and speak in
Mm.
certain moments. And then there's other moments where, you know, you have to sit back and you have to listen. And then maybe react to what people have to say, or not at all, or you just listen and you think about it, you know, and like talking about like music as a conversation, you know, or like
Hmm.
people are saying one thing here, they say something else over here. Like I invite listeners to think of music in that way of like it, and it can mean something completely different to the listener
Yeah.
than it did to the artist at the time. But that to me is what it's all about, you know.
And I don't think anybody or I couldn't have said it better myself. Like that is perfect. And yeah, I think that we can probably wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming on and sharing your stories and being such like a music nerd to someone who doesn't like really speak in those terms, but yet can understand exactly everything that you're saying. This has been so fantastic, and I appreciate you sharing your time with me and introducing me to Buried Inside.
Yes, thank you, John. I had a great time. I really appreciate you.
One thing that really struck me about that conversation as I was putting this episode together is when Andrea said she'd rather not exist than not be able to perform music. Obviously, not everyone needs to be that passionate about something. I mean, in my mind, if you're just trying your best every day and doing something that you want in a way that doesn't hurt anyone or anything, you're already living life the best way. You're already doing it right. But I do hope that that illustrates just how much musicians and artists give both to you and to the world in order to get their creations out there, and why you should always, always, always support what you love. Huge, huge, huge thanks to Andrea Morgan for sitting down and introducing me to Buried Inside. There is so much going on in that record that I really, really do encourage you to grab your best headphones, put them on, and spend some time with this record. It's also incredible that Mark and Andrea were able to connect in the way that they did, and I'm so happy she could share that story and we were able to facilitate all of that together, and I really hope that one day they get to perform together. So go and listen to Exulansis. You heard Andrea talk about their 2019 album, Sequestered Sympathy. It's a great place to start, and they also released 2 albums in 2023 called Overtures of Uprising, which is your standard, air quotes, standard blackened atmospheric doom metal fare, and then Hymns of Collapse, which is more your folky, acoustic, atmospheric journey. Perfect for your Sunday mornings with a coffee on your porch. Also listen to Rebecca Vernon's project, The Keening, who released their debut, Little Bird, in 2023. We spent a chunk of the first part of the episode talking about it because it is so fucking good. It's captivating, it is enthralling, emotional, and it is worth every single listen. And yes, it does take a couple to really settle it into your brain, but I can't recommend it enough. It is so good. And I also know for a fact that the next album is done and finished. It's just a matter about getting it out there. So hopefully we should have new music from The Keening sometime in 2025. So that is all I have got for you today, my friends. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your support. You can check us out on Instagram at Spinning the Wax, as well as on Patreon, where full unedited episodes of our album listen are there for you to sync the album to and pretend you are in the room with us. Special shout out to all of our marshmallows on Patreon, Dactyls, Triceracop, Chris Fletch, and Zero Signal, along with everybody else supporting the channel in whatever way they can, whether that is tossing us a buck, whether that is following us on social media, or just letting your friends know that we're here. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you thought about Buried Inside, what you think of Exulansis and The Keening, or Violinists in metal, or whatever it is that you want. Facilitate that conversation, my friends. If you are listening to this on Apple Music or Spotify, definitely give us a review. That helps us more than you could ever know. And then you can email spinningthewax@gmail.com. That's spinningthewax@gmail.com with whatever thoughts that you get. If you love Buried Inside, if you hate Buried Inside, if you want us to listen to like a Converge record or something like that, please do that. Always looking to hear from you and your thoughts on whatever it is that we've got going on in our little universe. So until next time, everybody, we will be back in 2 weeks when Tori Kravitz from She's with the Band and Knotfest listens to one of my personal favorite albums of all time, Dirt by Alice in Chains. See you on the other side, metalhead. Stay safe and stay sane. Stay heavy. Stay puffed.